Thank you. All right. Oop. So title of my lecture today is Fruit Trees, Catholic Themes, Expert Lists, the Story of Sephardic Surnames. It is long been an interest of mine, and I have written about it. If anybody would like, I can, of course, send them the article which this is based off of this presentation today. So my introduction, I'm going to show a series of a few images, and then I want to throw it out to the audience today if there's any connection between them. So first image, it's of course a pear tree. Second image, this is a rosary that was made in late modern Spain in the past few hundred years, according to the British Museum collection. And I have a screenshot of this list on the internet, the list of Sephardic surnames, and that there are supposedly more than 5,000 names on this list. So I may, if you want to type in the chat, what do you think is the relationship between all three of these images? Or if Ton and David, you would like to answer as well.
Pereira, I don't know, De La Cruz.
So we have one that says related to the nature. David, as you said, Pereira de la Cruz. Bruce Kahn says roots. I'm going to go ahead and now show you the next screen. The connection to all three, in big part, is this: a Spanish and Portuguese passport. And why the connection? So to begin with the first image, one of the biggest myths that is peddled today, mainly through heritage tourism, and I myself experienced with a tour guide in Portugal, fruit trees and plants are a supposed marker that you're actually of a Jewish background. Another myth that's peddled around is that Jews, when they were forced to become Catholic, took on the most Catholic, iconography, the names De La Cruz, Santa Cruz, Jesus, all these very Catholic names. And again, as I'll go into depth, that has nothing to do with it. And then that purported list that I showed above has caused consternation for almost all of us here professionally, as it was a fraudulent list that was a poor copy of earlier bibliographic work done by the late Harry Stein with Sephardim.com. And the problem, just in brief about Sephardim.com and how it sort of contributed to this, was while it was a reference database, a lot of people did not take the time to actually read what it was and made a lot of assumptions that, oh, my surname is this, it's on this list, it means I'm Sephardic, which is not the case. It was a list of surnames that were used at some point by somebody in the Sephardic community, whether historically or today. And that even included Ashkenazi surnames, non-Jewish, German, Russian people who had just married into the community or just showed up in the index of a reference book that was mainly on a Sephardic community. So what is a Sephardic surname? To put it simply, it is any surname that is used by someone in the Sephardic community today and historically. That is very much relating to the quote unquote religious history in community, as there's nothing in halakha that says, oh, you cannot become Sephardic. You just accept the customs and the rulings of the community that you join. That's why, for example, a lot of the Western Sephardic world genealogically does come from Ashkenazi roots, but they accepted and joined the Portuguese, the Western Sephardic Minhag, under the Talmud Torah of Amsterdam and Bevis Marx in London. But for the purposes of today, I want to narrow it down to basically the history of surnames in the Iberian Peninsula and their use amongst the Jewish community. So at the base level, historically, surnames began to be used in the Iberian Peninsula over 1,000 years ago, though they didn't really stick until a few hundred years later. Patronyms introduced by the Visigoths. A famous example of that would be Rodriguez, which is actually the patronym, the son of Roderick, or a very German name, but that was commonly associated with the wider Hispano-Lusitano world. But amongst the Jewish community, you start seeing the adoption of stable surnames around 1,000 years ago. We know this because we have documents connecting family names that appeared 900 years ago continuously within the Sephardic community. For example, the Palace family, which I will discuss a little bit later, and the Zacuto family, which I will also be discussing more in depth. And historically, Sephardic surnames can be divided into two categories: the pre-expulsion surname and post-forced conversion, aka new Christian surnames. So pre-expulsion surnames, these are surnames that could be toponyms, Arabic names, occupations, Hebrew names, and more. And here I have a selection of some well-known pre-expulsion surnames, such as Abarbanel, Aboav, Almosnino, Altaras, Amarillo, Benaroya, Benatar, Haleva, Herrera, Marcos, Nahmias, Palache, Policar, Saporta, Saltiel, Senor, Sion, and Zacuto. And of course, there's many more, but these are among some of the more well-known names, and many of whom the families are still around 1,000 years later. And another note on this is that within the context of our genetic study with Avotenu DNA, that we have been able to uncover that, yes, the surname traditions are legitimate. An Almosnino in Morocco is the same as an Almosnino in Salonika. But we're still continuing to do further work. And then Haleva too is another one that we have successfully seen all across, as well as Ebenatar. Basically, it tells us that these surnames are quite ancient and quite old, and that they have been continuously used. Not though in some cases we see multiple lineages, like the Saltiel family has multiple lineages, but to that point, we don't know yet what the reason is for that. It could be that there are just independently several Saltiel families that took on the name. There is a distinct possibility that at some point the ancestor was more illustrious and we have a matrilineal passing down of the name, which happens sometimes in the Sephardic community, though not as often as you would see sometimes in the Ashkenazi community. But again, this is sort of your, the origins of Sephardic surnames is here at the pre-expulsion, pre-1492. And then on the other hand, we have the new Christian surnames. So these surnames were given to the Jews who were forcibly baptized to become new Christians in Portugal, or otherwise known as conversos in Spain. The acquisition of surnames was simple. For the new Christians in Portugal, it was and also the conversos in Spain, it was the baptismal surname of the old Christian godparents of the Jews. So in Portugal was the largest case of it in 1496 and 1497, when the Jews were forcibly converted by decree of the king. And this was done in order to assimilate the new Christians and make them indistinguishable from the old Christians. Of course, we know that didn't actually happen. There was a lot of prejudice. The Inquisition courts, particularly in Portugal, were very active in persecuting the new Christian community, less so in Spain, even though there was a lot of persecution there. But the main bulk of the activity of the Inquisition court in Portugal is against Judaizers or these new Christians. And examples of the surnames, some of them are below, like Da Costa, Da Fonseca, Da Vega, Delgado, Fernandez, Gomez, Enriquez, Nunes, Lopez, Marques, Mendes, Pinto, Pereira, Rodriguez, and Vaz. And here's an example of one of these new Christians. This is from a proceso of the for Judaizing of Gaspar Fernandez Gallego. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but his name is where my cursor is, Gaspar Fernandez, with the typical abbreviation for the name Gallego, that he was a merchant, a new Christian, and that he was the age of 62. That proceso is available online. You can go view it through the website authoritative. But again, this name is functionally indistinguishable from anybody else in Portugal at the time. This is just or Iberia for that matter, as a whole. So what is important here to remember is that new Christian surnames are indistinguishable from non-Jewish Old Christian surnames because they are the same. And that furthermore, as is the naming tradition still today in Portugal, but also in other places in Spain, you can have innumerable combinations of surnames, including siblings with different surnames entirely, as long as the family names existed within the recent genealogy of the family. Now, once these families arrived to the return to Judaism in the Amsterdam, Livorno, Hamburg, London, these double names typically stayed stable as well, though you have a period in the 18th and 19th centuries where families were fearful of their name dying out. So you see new combinations occurring, like Cohen Senior in Amsterdam. You also have Curiel Abbas, but that occurred much earlier in the 17th century. Also to delineate different lines of the family, as it were. So some of these family names that are famous, Abu de Fonseca, which comes from the same family as the Haham, Isaac Abu de Fonseca, Franco Mendes, Gomez da Costa, Enriquez Nunes, Lopez Pereira, which was the topic of this, I believe, just last week of the Sephardic World Meeting. You see Rodriguez Pereira, which many people know the name very well. Vas Nunes, Vas Villarreal from Livorno. But again, you see what's to be important to remember here is that when we're dealing with the families, even post return to the Jewish community, siblings can still have different surnames. And I will talk about that in a small case study at the end of this presentation. So here's a couple of very good reference books. The first one on the right, the Diccionario Sephardi de Sobrenombres, which is basically the original reference book for looking at Sephardic surnames. Some of them have a little bit of the etymology, but basically it's looking at where did these names show up documented around the Sephardic world. The left two are by Alexander Bider, and they are recently published, and they also accomplish much of the same, though there's a little bit more detail in both of them. But again, they're reference books. They're providing actual bibliographic references to where they show up in archives or communities. So they are really what is the best available currently for looking at Sephardic surnames as a whole and their entirety. And they also, as I mentioned again, there's some etymology there as well. So if you wanted to know what it means or where, what combination of names it's coming from or where it's thought to reference, these are your books to go to. So I'm going to discuss now 3 case studies, and I'm intentionally keeping this presentation a bit short because I want to open it up to further discussion and questions so I can better answer them. And again, there are so many more stories and myths to get into. But I really wanted to make sure that this was as accessible and a sort of laying the groundwork for a much more in-depth discussion down the road. So I want to show, first of all, the Amarillo family. Here is a tax receipt from Tudela in the Kingdom of Navarre in Spain. This is actually a fairly well-known historical tax collector, Samuel Amarillo. There's an entry in the Jewish Encyclopedia about him, and his signature is at the bottom here. It says Shemuel Amarillo, and this is from 1388. And this, I got a copy of it thanks to researcher and archivist Maria Jose Sorribas in Barcelona. Now here, 60 years later, the family shows up in Portugal. There's a wonderful archival document from the books of Dom Alfonso V, King Dom Alfonso V. And this list is one of the best references for Jews in Portugal in that time period in 1441. It's a list of the licenses granted to conduct commerce with Christians of the kingdom. And in this case, within the box, there's potentially their brothers or father and son. It doesn't make it any clear, but it's Yusa Amarillo and Samuel Amarillo, both of Tavira in the south of Portugal, that they were granted the license to conduct commerce. And this dates to November 1441. The next time we really see this family is in Salonika. The right is the title page of the Kerem Shelomo, which was written by the chief rabbi of Salonika, Shelomo Amarillo, in 1719 or so. The Hebrew year 5479 was when it was published, shortly before he passed away. And on the left is the book, the Debar Moshe, by his son, Moshe Haim Amarillo, who replaced him as the chief rabbi of Salonika after upon the death of the triumvirate that Shlomo was a part of. And this is mid 17th and 18th century. And then here again in the 19th century, we have Shem Tov Amarillo, a descendant of the above two rabbis. This is his signature on a ketubah from Corfu from August 20th, 1830. The family, I know them. They are still around today. There's a couple of well-known members, including the late Erica Colonio Amarillo. But they are still around today, and it's a name that, again, we've seen for 800 years, and it's the same family. Next, we have the Zacuto family, which I believe some of you might be a little more familiar with. And so here, from that same document I showed earlier, a different page, the license was granted to Judas Zacuto of Puvia, and his name is underlined in Burgundy. And here is a document that many may know the person on it. This is a receipt, or rather an order for payment from Dom Jal II to Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, who was the famous astronomer and author. As you can see at the top, it says Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, and then below is his signature in Hebrew. And this is dates from June 9th, 1493, just a couple of years before the end of Jewish life in Portugal. As we knew it, Abraham Zacuto ended up being able to flee eastward, and he died either in the Holy Land or Damascus. It's not entirely sure, but sometime in the second decade of the 16th century. But this family spread all over. Here is the signature of the well-known New Christian Abraham Zacuto, or the Dr. Zacutus Lusitanus. It's his signature in Amsterdam, in the Escamoth of the Portuguese Jewish community. This is from 1639, 1640, from when the community officially unified from the three disparate synagogues. And then we see again here, now going all the way eastward to Istanbul, This is the grave of a Yom Tov Nassim Zakuto in Haskoy Cemetery. This dates from June 13th, 1861. This, again, another family that is still around today. There is an Ashkenazi family that claims that they're Zakuto, but there is no evidence of that at this time, and they appear to just be Ashkenazi, but there are actual Sephardi descendants from the Turkish of the Zakuto family, though many of the Portuguese Zakutos, either the family died out in the 19th century, as is the case in Amsterdam, or they were lost in the Holocaust, especially the case with the Italian family. And now finally, a short little case of a Mendes family. This is the marriage of a Heitor Mendes and Isabel Gomes in Bissau in Portugal from March 30th, 1625. This family ended up falling afoul of the Inquisition of Toledo in Madrid, but they had fled northward to Bayonne by this point in southwest France. But here we see by this time, 32 years later, here's the signature of the same man on his daughter's marriage ban in front of the Catholic Church, the Santa Eulalie in Bordeaux in 1657. And so, as I mentioned before, with different surnames and surname combinations, to this point, the children of Heitor Mendes that have been documented by me include Francisco Mendes Choreno, Diogo Mendes Choreno, Manuel Nunes Mantensa, who became David Nunes Mantensa in Amsterdam, Esther Mendes, Elizabeth Mendes, Michel Mendes, Jean or Juan Mendes, Minasse Mendes, Arnaud Mendes, Isabel, who became Rachel Mendes in London, Moses Mendes Choreno, who is also known as Antonio Mendes de Aguirre, who died in Amsterdam, and then Joseph Mendes and Solomon Mendes, who were in Barbados and London, respectively. And here again, this is a question of, Joseph and Solomon may actually be the Francisco and Diogo who are mentioned above, but we don't know because unfortunately, we don't yet have I have not been able to uncover the evidence of who they exactly were. And the same goes for Manasseh. We don't know what his Christian name was living as a Catholic in Bordeaux, where he was born. So here's that Manasseh Mendes in Amsterdam. He got married there in 1681. It says he's from Bordeaux. He's 35. He married Deborah Aboab, not the Aboab da Fonseca, but Aboab Osario family of Amsterdam. And here from Laura Liebman's wonderful database, the Jewish Atlantic World, we have the gravestone of his brother, Joseph Mendes, who died there in 1707. This family has been studied about in terms of slaveholding and also the early Barbados community by Dr. Why am I forgetting his name? Ton, do you remember who I'm talking about? I guess.
No, sorry, I don't remember.
Edgar Samuel's father.
No.
Anyway, but
Wilfred.
Yeah, Wilfred. There we go. Wilfred has written about them.
Yeah.
In the context of the early development of the Barbados community. I myself am working on research on this family from a different angle. But that's where I wanted to leave this presentation for now, because I'm sure many of you have lots of questions and would like, maybe answers more tailored towards your specific case. So with that, I will open the floor back up to you, Ton and David, and let's see how we go.
Thank you very much. I mean, first of all, I have to express my absolute shock at the suggestion that people might be claiming to have Sephardic ancestry for the purpose of obtaining Portuguese or Spanish passports. Actually, shocking idea, and certainly shocking that the idea that any, for example, Israeli law firm might be involved in such a scurrilous practice. Can I also just comment, because at the beginning you mentioned the website Sephardim.com, started by Harry Stein, and I was in touch with him, and he was actually promoting the idea that all of the surnames on his site were Sephardic. Later, I persuaded him, or myself and others persuaded him, to put a little footnote on the site, but I don't know if he ever necessarily believed that. But I mean, obviously, we're living with the consequences today. There's a number of questions on YouTube. And Angelo's asking about the Sadaka or Sadaka surname, and whether you know how far that can go back.
So the Sadaka family is my suspicion, and it's a name that is exclusively in the Ottoman Empire. But it is a surname that again, it takes much more research, and this is not my specific interest, but it appears to be a Romaniot family. You do see names like that amongst the Romaniot Jews of the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah.
So that would be my suspicion. It's not a name that I've come across in Spain or Portugal or any of certainly the Western Sephardic community. But it's a name that I do know from Istanbul in that area. And that was a heavily Romanio community before it ultimately Sephardized about 2 centuries after the expulsion.
Okay, thank you. Could you close your presentation so we can see you full screen? Okay, I'm going to read a message from Karen. Could you explain how my Ashkenazi family from Lithuania was named Ritvo after the acronym Ritva from Sevilla before the Inquisition? Why didn't they get an Ashkenazi name?
To put it quite simply, there's no etymological evidence that is in fact named for the acronym. Sephardic Jews very rarely. In fact, I can think of maybe one example where they were using an acronym as a surname. It's just not something that happened. I would refer to Alexander Bider's books on the Ashkenazi surnames for a deeper answer onto the etymology, but I don't see any relationship at all between Ritvo and the Rabbi Ben Adair, which I believe is where the acronym is being connected to.
Okay, thank you. We won't ask about the Sephardic Abramovich family from Lithuania. Andre asks, are we sure the names were necessarily taken from godparents? One of my ancestors' forced godparents used the name Almeida, but she took the name Anadias in 1496.
Yes, we know that they took the godparent surnames, except again in super rare circumstances, the most famous being the conversion of Abraham Senior, who was Isabella's favorite rabbi, and the king and queen decided to give them the noble house named Coronel.
We have a question about the origin of the Saporta surname.
Saporta, I would have to get back to you, but as far as I know, it's a toponym, meaning it comes from a place name. I don't remember what it's referring to though, so I would have to get back to you on that. Okay,
there's another question which is slightly off topic. I'm wondering if Sephardic people from Amsterdam ended up in Cambridgeshire, England. perhaps I can answer that. That perhaps if
Maybe.
they came to London, yeah, maybe. We have a question on the origins of the Samuda surname.
On the Samuda surname, I unfortunately do not have any information. I'd have to look into it, but I'm happy to take a look.
Yeah, I think the earliest Samudas in London were related to Dr. Sarmiento, and I think, oh gosh, I can't remember. I think we found some town in south central Portugal that they may have come.
Yeah, I vaguely recall this.
London.
Yeah. Somebody says, I believe Levy became Lent to get a boat out of Europe.
In what context?
I would be surprised at that, but who knows? Oh, here's an interesting one. My family's from Gallipoli in Turkey with the name
Okay.
Cohen. Do we know how far back that name goes? Because
Cohen?
I mean, are different Cohenim all related or?
Okay, so the name Cohen does go back to the very beginnings of the Jewish people. It's one of the few. It didn't quite become. It was a title, not necessarily a surname, but it was familial, or it is familial, I should say. So it wasn't being used in a surname like we would understand a surname today. Surnames are a fairly modern construction, but it was the descriptor. Okay, that that's Yehonatan the Cohen, which is why the title is HaKohen in Hebrew today still. But we do know, and this comes from the ongoing genetic work, that there are multiple Cohen lineages that date back to antiquity. There's one predominant one, but there's multiple others that, so it is quite an old title, one that has been passed down patrilineally as is amongst the Jewish people for thousands of years at this point. That being said, to do further research on your specific Cohen line, we'd have to discuss further, as well as, we could absolutely have them test as part of our study, as they are a Sephardic Cohen from Gallipoli, if there are any patrilineal descendants, and then we can see to which haplogroup do they belong, or are they a new Cohen haplogroup? So that would be my answer to that. It's Cohen, again, ancient title that has transformed into a surname over the centuries, but it is real. It is legitimate. It goes back to the very beginnings of the Jewish people 3,000 years ago.
Thank you. We also have a question about where the whole sort of fruit tree thing in Portugal came from, or when it might have appeared. Does anyone know?
I don't quite know when who was the origin of this myth. I think it's a late 20th century creation, but I'd have to do a lot more research than probably I care to, other than to debunk the myth. But it is a popular one today that all the tour guides in Portugal and Spain like to talk about. I was on a tour in Évora, and the tour guide wanted to start saying that, these symbols were Stars of David, and then that fruit trees. And I said, well, actually, I'm a historian of the community, and then he's like, oh yeah, that is correct. But no, it's I don't want to say it's like harmful. It's just one of these many myths that has been popularized, particularly for heritage tourism reasons, because it's a nice story. Now there are many Sephardic Jews who have names like Pereira that are fruit trees. But there's also many old Christians, old Iberians who have the name too, because it's just a name in Iberia.
Yeah, I actually heard from Ashkenazi Birnbaum who claimed the name had been changed from Pereira and should receive Portuguese citizenship on that basis. Ton, do you want to? Sorry, I've been sort of just yakking. Do you want to?
Maybe you should say something about the Mendes name. How common is it, and are all persons with the name Mendes related to each other?
So the name Mendes is extremely common, both in the Jewish community and the wider Spanish Portuguese community. Not all Mendezes are related. Certainly not all Mendezes in the Jewish community are related. There's multiple families. And one of the helpful things that a few of them did was they differentiated themselves by the double name, most famous one being the Mendes da Costa, which distinguished themselves by that name. And it was actually a double name the family had been using for a few centuries before that as Catholics. So you do see, or Mendes Gama is another one. The family I mentioned before is really Mendes Serrano, but they use multiple variants, sometimes dropping it, sometimes adding it. There's multiple unrelated families, and I know it's a truism, but if you want to research the family you're looking at, you have to do the genealogical work. And I can give a good example of confusion in Amsterdam. There's a Dr. Jacob Israel Mendez that I'm researching, who's part of who joins the Amsterdam community around 1632. And at the same time, there is already a Jacob Israel Mendez who is a merchant. And the merchant family keeps using the name Jacob Israel Mendez. So his son and grandson has it, 40 years later. And there's more than a few times where I've seen people confuse the three men as all a pastiche of one person. Mm-hmm. So just because of a common name, you don't have to, you can't assume that they're the same family. Even as a double name that has two common names in common. So most famously for Amsterdam and Antwerp and Livorno, you have the Vash Nunes family and the Nunes Vas family. And they're not related. They're two different families. They might, maybe they share an ancestor somewhere, like almost all Portuguese Jews do, because it's not a huge community. But yeah, the etymological and origins of the names are different when we're dealing with the combos.
Yeah. I was wondering about these double names that you presented on the slide. Among them was Aboab the Fonseca. And what about the name Aboab? Is that Portuguese or Hebrew?
Aboab, I believe, is Arabic. I'd have to look. I don't have the reference. I don't have my reference book with me. It's in my apartment in Israel. Mm-hmm. But as far as I remember, it's of Arabic origin, but I can find that out.
Yeah, related to that, a number of families arriving in Amsterdam early 17th century took Jewish surnames, and some of them combined their Portuguese surname with a Jewish surname, like Aboab da Fonseca, mm-hmm. and or Cohen Rodriguez,
or Ibn Akar Bondia.
Yeah. And how far did these families remember the family name that they had before they were forcibly baptized? Or did you just take a nice sounding name in Amsterdam, like I think the family Zakuta did?
I mean, I feel very strongly, based off of my reading, also the Portuguese processos that I've done, that the families knew who they were. Of course, if we're talking, we start seeing lack of that, by the people returning in the late 17th, early 18th century. You don't see so many taking on a old surname, but many of the I believe the Abulavs are the Abulavs, the Nars are the Nars.
Mm.
The Abarbanels, I believe, are the Abarbanels. And again, this is also a case of, I don't, because they're doing it in the Portuguese tradition of surnaming. So that's why I feel like these families, they tend to be already related, but we unfortunately don't quite know how at this point, because the parish books no longer exist. But this is a case where they're differentiating themselves by using the Portuguese name to say we're from this branch of the family. I feel, unlike the late H.P. Solomon's, that these names are not a creation, but actually based off of a legitimate oral history that's being passed down. These families knew who they were. I look at, in the case of the late H.P. Solomon's, his article on the Pinto family manuscript. And, on the one hand, he's claiming that we're dealing with good Catholics who were turned into Jews by the Inquisition, whereas a deeper look at the Procesos, which is available today, is that the family was constantly Judaizing from the very beginning of the Inquisition. This is not a family that was, a God-fearing Catholic and sitting in mass every Sunday. This was a family who remember their origins. I often look at it as this is very legitimate oral history. And two, when we look at that manuscript, the history he's relaying can be confirmed by supporting documents, even if it's very wide ranging. So we know that there is a lot of truth, and maybe a few names get fudged here and there, which we found, both you and I, but that the overall history is largely correct. And that's impressive for a family to capture 200 years of oral history and memory, and retain that knowledge right down to a T. I do see, I will say, we do see a lot of that amongst even communities today that are at risk, where they or persecuted, where they switch to oral forms of testimony and history, because a written document could get you in trouble. That oral histories, especially when you're coming down from a point where you're at risk or persecuted, that they often largely are correct in many ways. And they also telling a form of the truth that reflects their experience. But again, I fall very strongly on these are not made up names. There is how they're connected to those families, I think, is potentially lost to time at this point. But there's no reason not to suspect that, maybe their second or third great grandfather was actually Abuab, and that they just belong to the branch that came later. But we also look at that and say, if the community accepted them as members of this family, then they probably knew or had something that identified them. The assumptions of Cohen get a little more, I guess the Cohen ones do fall under the same tradition where there's an ancestor who was Cohen, but maybe they don't belong, their Y DNA says they belong to one of the minor or a new haplogroup, which doesn't mean that they aren't Cohens. It just means that I think it attests to this Portuguese surname tradition that people were connecting to their Jewish ancestor, but they didn't necessarily remember that, oh, my Cohen great-great-grandfather who was forcibly baptized in Porto in 1497, that was actually my mom's side. But that the community regarded them as such, I very much agree that there's no reason not to think that these are the families who they say they are, especially when the testing that we've done with Avotenu for these older families does show that the family surnames are stable.
Okay.
Francis has been waiting for a while. Do you want to
Yes,
ask?
there are two things actually. What you've just said about oral history. Oral history is deeply embedded in people who are chronically marginalized. I did a most enormous amount of oral history with coal miners, with all sorts of people in this country over many years. It's highly poetic and highly brilliant, and is a different version of history, because it's the version of history that's excluded from knowledge. And so the language and the formation of that is amazing. And I'm sure it's exactly the same with what you've heard. Now, that leads me on to a question about my relatives who are Abulafia and Halevi. Now, they showed no signs of having been driven out of anywhere. To pop across from Egypt in about 1921, settled down in Manchester. They tried to die in Israel and failed. They had to die in Manchester. And so that thread didn't seem to be, well, they didn't talk about it, certainly, that level of oppression. Was there a difference in the sort of exodus from Egypt and those Middle Eastern countries to the ones where I think they were in Spain. I've got my passport, or I'm about to get the Portuguese passport, so the thread goes through. But they never, in fact, reflected that complicated history, though I don't think it was simple.
So just to respond to your oral history, I, in my previous life working with the Seminole people of Florida in my undergrad career, people on the margins who are have a very different view of history. And it's not to get totally Marxist on, but it's the history from below, which is a big part of my research ethos, and that, we have to listen to what people are saying and not just, listening to the grandiose epics of victorious generals on the battlefield. So I think there's a lot more value. There's always value in oral history, but I find that oral histories of I want to say, like, there's a better or worse, but the oral history of saying that, my grandfather's family were Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain to Lithuania is totally booby meisels. It's nonsense, but it comes out of a very real ideology that arose in the early 19th century with the rise of the Haskalah and emancipation, that there's this sort of term of Western Jews versus Eastern Jews, that the further east you go, the next level looks down on the next further east. So in the 19th century, the history of Sephardic Jewry was seen as like the epitome. Even if it was, let's not listen to them religiously, it was that, we have a glorious history in Al-Andalus. So in those cases, I look a little more, like, okay, this comes from a different place. But when we're talking about that, other history, it's those I give a little more credence to on that aspect. But as far as Abulafia, so I take it you are familiar with that. Abulafia means in Arabic the father of Levi. Essentially, it's a Levi family. There's probably, again, like Mendes, probably multiple unrelated Abulafia families. Or if they are related, they're related, just by marriage or something. But when you talk about what occurred in the Middle East in the 20th century, so it's complicated. It sounds like your Abulafia came to England at the beginnings of English colonization of Egypt, which is a different experience than, say, had they left 40 years later under Nasser.
Yes.
So there, at that point, Egypt was, in many ways, people treated Egypt as like the cosmopolitan Mecca. And there was a lot of development there, not only because of the English colonization. They actually got there after Egypt had already begun developing in a major way as they pushed away from the Ottoman Empire. But it's a cornucopia of Jewish communities. That's why when talking about the Jews of Egypt, more than any other Jewish community in North Africa or the Middle East, you have to always keep in mind that the vast majority of the Jewish community in Egypt is very young. It dates to the late 19th or late 20th century. It's a mix of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Yemeni, Persian, Mughrabi. It was one of the centers of the Jewish world at that point. And another part of that was the movements of the Alliance School, bringing teachers from all over and settling them in Cairo and Alexandria. But it's about timing, and that would be the difference between how your family experienced Egypt as opposed to maybe, I don't know if you had family who stayed behind, but maybe your second or third cousins who left because everything had been confiscated, their passports taken, forced to walk across the border or take a flight to Paris with nothing but the suitcases on their back.
Thank you.
There's a question about Tauro. Does it relate to Torah, maybe?
Which name?
Tauro, the Toro family from Amsterdam.
As far as I know, no, that there's no connection. It's that would be a bit of a strong vowel shift, which there's no indication of.
Okay, another etymological question. Is the Pas, what is the meaning of the surname De Pas? Has it to do with peace?
So there's the De Pas family is interesting because there's a lot of sort of folk etymology around the name that it really means De Pas, which Pas was a archaic Hebraic form for the name of gold. There's no connection. I'd have to take a look more deeply, but the name De Pas, using the de, is typically indicative of a toponym, a place name. What it's referring to, I don't have that knowledge, sitting in front of me, but it's more likely than not a toponymic name.
Okay. Daniel asks if was is vice or vas.
It is. I won't be going into it today because I'm in the process of editing my manuscript for publication on it. But as soon as that is published, I'll be happy to return and talk about that because it's an interesting story that came out of left field that we were very skeptical of.
Bernard, you have a question?
Yeah, I have several, but just on the vases, I have a whole line that comes down on my Sephardic side that go through Baes and Bas and Vas and Was, but I also have Vases who become Basses and Boases on my Ashkenazi side. So it's really difficult to draw any conclusion from that. I've got three specifics. One, I had a 14th great-grandfather with the unassuming surname of Homem in Portuguese, which means man, who on arrival in Amsterdam changed it to Abendana, which, as I understand it, means children of Babylon, and it came from Abendanan. And I'd be fascinated to know why, whether or not they thought or they had an oral history saying that they were descended from the exile, or whether or not it was one of these things that they thought would give them prestige. In that same family, you find lots of aliases. So I have, for example, another ancestor who had the name Tebare de Cordoba, Tebare being the Spanish version of Tiberius, and Cordoba being Cordoba, and he changed his name to Gabriel Milan, but Milan not being the place, but I think being a derivation from the Portuguese Milan, from the Hebrew meaning dictionary, because it turns out that a couple of generations earlier, there had been generations of lexicographers. So I'm wondering if they were sending the message, we are the people of the word, or of the book of the word, which was the dictionary in this case. And I had a question about, well, it's two questions. One, the Rodriguezes that you talked about, my 15th great-grandfather was a Rodriguez who appears to have descended from the Aboabs of Toledo through Dinises, and they've come down through the Osorios to me, which I find fascinating. But I have a question. It's something that Daniel Horowitz of My Heritage raises frequently, and he claims that the Horowitzes were descended from a specific Sephardic Jew, Yosef Halevi, who was a rabbi in Barcelona in the 14th century, who moved to somewhere just outside Prague with a lot of money, bought a town called Horowice, became mayor of it, and took and retained the name. And I wondered, maybe Adam Brown, as he's here, would be able to say something about the, thank you, Adam, okay. Because this is one of these myths that, that gets perpetuated, and I wondered whether there was anything in it.
So just to add to Adam, it's nonsense. It's actually, I think Adam might be able to link the article in the chat, but there was a thorough historical study tracing the origin of it. And the earliest Horowitzes, which their writings survive, make absolutely no mention of this. And then it suddenly appears in the Yichus of the one of the Horowitzes in the mid-19th century, which is, again, the same time that it became popular to claim an Andalusian ancestry, a Sephardic Golden Age. It's complete and utter nonsense. The fact that it continues to get perpetuated, even though the historical evidence agrees with the genetic evidence, because the genetic evidence is absolutely 100% clear that this is the Horowitz-Halevi line, which is, again, the Halevi family that is the majority of all Ashkenazi Levites, has a shared origin around 2,000 years ago in the Middle East without passing through Iberia. Any Sephardim on it are well within Ashkenazi clusters, which indicates that they're Ashkenazi Levites who moved into Sephardic communities at some point, but it's a lot of nonsense. And as far as the other stuff, particularly going 14th and 15th generation, it really we have to look at the actual documentation, because it's really hard to say, and especially because, unfortunately, there's a lot of well-meaning genealogists, particularly of the Western Sephardic community, who connect names that have no relationship, turning 4 or 5 people who are contemporary into one person. But as to say it isn't correct, it's just you have to go and look at the originals. And as far as Ibn Dana, that's, again, an old name, pre-expulsion surname. I referred to my previous answer where I say, that I very much fall on the side of that this is a real memory. Now, whether it's, Ibn Dana direct paternal line, that I couldn't tell you, because that is, at this point, unless you get lucky and find a series of Inquisition processos connecting from the original Ibn Dana who converted to your Ibn Dana, then you're a little bit stuck at this point, because the historical record, particularly for tracking people through the churches, runs out in many places by the early 17th century, though in some places it exists at the beginning of the 16th century.
Thank you. Can I just add on the Abandanas that they came to England and were, I think, Hachams in Bevis Marks, but there were two brothers who also taught at Cambridge. So, and they came to England from Holland. So that answers a question that was asked earlier. Thanks.
Thank you. Randy Schoenberg discussed the Horowitz claims on the program we did, I think, on the 13th of November last year on claims of Ashkenazis having Sephardic origins. Ton, do you want to continue? I'm afraid we've got just so many questions in both places. If we continue on Zoom.
The chat, maybe we can get back to some people or produce a document that that answers them all.
I'm happy to keep talking as long as you need, though.
Yeah, what about the Pinto family, someone asks.
The which family?
Pinto, the Pinto. There's a rich family in Amsterdam, but there are also the Pintos from Morocco. Are they related?
No, there's no indication of it. There's Pinto, again, like Mendes, is a family that also is found amongst pre-expulsion Sephardic Jews. But this, again, there's no relationship to Pinto, the De Pinto family of Amsterdam, Rotterdam. They were Pinto as New Christians. We actually have their genealogy going back well before the manuscript, because some of their earliest ancestors were amongst the first Jews who were prosecuted by the Inquisition in Portugal.
Any questions on YouTube, David?
Hundreds.
Okay.
You addressed double surnames already. Just sort of general question about the Osorio de Castro family of Curacao. I don't really know if very much can be said about them.
Probably from Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody else is asking about the Paz, which we've discussed.
Joe Ergas asks, does the name Ergas go back to the Iberian Peninsula?
As far as I know, it does. I haven't specifically looked at the Ergas family, but it's a name that shows up in, as Joel is familiar with, all over the Sephardic Balkans. It's also a name that shows up in the Portuguese communities as one of these names that gets connected with a Portuguese name as well. So as far as I know, it dates to pre-expulsion, Spain and Portugal.
Pete Glass asks if you know something about Lealtad. I believe that's a Moroccan name, but...
Lealtad, Lealtad?
Yes.
I don't know about that specific family. I know it's a family that also does show up into the Western Sephardic world, but I think it enters through Morocco. Because we know the family that they show up in Suriname, briefly in Amsterdam, in Southwest France. But I don't have any specific information. I can look into it.
Okay, we have questions about Sephardic haplogroups, or Y-DNA. Is J1 and JM267, are these Sephardic, is the question.
First of all, J1 and JM267 are the exact same thing. Second of all, JM267 formed about 31,000 years ago. And I'm not trying to be rude, I'm rather trying to be blunt. J1 really effectively means nothing other than that you share a common ancestor with half of the Middle East and North Africa and parts of Europe, dating back 31,000 years ago. You, of course, are welcome to join the results to our project. I know Adam has posted it in the chat here, but we can, if you want to, you can go to the link www.jewishdna.org and join your results to our project. And we can, of course, take a look and see. But really, when we're dealing with Y chromosomes, the only way to know, unless it's abundantly clear that you have immediate Sephardic matches, is to do full sequencing to see where you actually fit on the Y chromosomal family tree, the phylogenetic tree, because otherwise, I myself am J1, so that means that you and I share an ancestor 31,000 years ago. Hi to my 3,000th cousin, 10 times removed, who knows? But I say that jokingly, but really that's what it means. And that to know further, you have to go in further, just like with genealogy, you have to dive deeper.
Okay. Oh, here's one I should definitely give to Ton. I think the Puritans smuggled Jews from Amsterdam to Massachusetts, Mayflower, etc.
No.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
That's an interesting theory.
Okay, great. We've got a question about the Moron and Algamis families. About what I've heard.
Which Moron family?
It is not said.
Okay.
The Moron family.
So the reason I asked is because there's two prominent Moron families in the Jewish world. There's the Enriquez Moron or Moral of the Western Sephardic world, who mainly settled in Curacao and in the Caribbean. But there's also the Moron family of Aydin and Izmir that is connected to the Moron family of Livorno. They're unrelated, but they're Portuguese. The Algamis, I don't have anything specific on that family, but Algamis tells me it's an Arabic name.
Yeah.
And that etymology I can look into.
So my ninth great-grandparents, Gabriel Fernandez and Ana Anuda, were from Salonika. Surname Fernandez is okay, but what about Anuda? Have you ever heard of that name?
And I've seen the name in Portugal, but it's those. I think I'm familiar with the Inquisition file that is being referenced, and that's the Portuguese names of those families being given. That's not necessarily what what name they would have been going by in the Jewish community in Salonika.
Yeah. Do you know anything about the Nunez Cardozo family? This is one of those stable double surnames.
Yes, the Nunez Cardozo family. They're actually part of our study. It's again one of these, at least in the Portuguese world, once they became Nunez Cardozo, it's stable. A Western Sephardi Nunez Cardozo is the same as a Western Sephardi Nunez Cardozo in Amsterdam and Jamaica. In London, but at this point, we don't know much more beyond that. It's the family. The name comes from the Portuguese, but that would be just like many of the a good example of a Portuguese name being used as a double, or actually a couple would be like the Pereira Brandon family, the Lopez Pereira, the Vasvia Real, using stable double surnames, Nunes Vas. But that beyond that, it would have to be identifying who was if you can identify who the ancestor was that became part of the Jewish community, and if you can find anything relating to them in any of the Inquisition or church documents that survive.
Okay, the Anuda family were from Izmir, if that helps, but you addressed that already. Ellen asked if you can repeat the the website for the DNA?
So it's www.jewishdna, all one word, .org. If you have a kit, you can join it to our database and we can take a look. If you don't, you should email adam.brown, BROWN, at all one word, avlutenudna.org.
Thank you. And there's a question about the Spani, Gashi, and Poro families.
The which families?
I've never heard Spani, S-P-A-N-I. Then next one, Gashi, G-A-S-H-I. And finally, Poro, P-O-R-O.
I apologize, but I've not heard of any of those families, at least in the Jewish world.
Okay, useful trivia. Poro means deer in Finnish. Dennis is saying that the al prefix from Iberia was due to the naming style when the Arabs were in control. It doesn't necessarily mean the family were of Arab origin. That's what we know. Am I right in thinking that sort of al is more Moroccan and el is more from elsewhere, or is that just
no? So when I say Arabic origin, I don't mean that the families were Arab Jews or whatever. I mean, it literally comes from the Arabic language. So I want to make that clear that I wasn't making a claim of ethno-religious identity or construction, but rather because for the Sephardic world, the dominant language for a very long time was and is Arabic. It's the language that they were speaking in Babylon before until the Gaonic period ended, and it transferred leadership to Iberia, where the dominant language was Arabic, and that it was a language that all Jews of that area would have had some, if not being their native language, and that Hebrew learning would have actually, one of my favorite stories of it is the revival of Hebrew amongst the Jewish community can be in many ways attributed to Sadia Gaon, who was perhaps the greatest leader of that Gaonic period in Babylon. And he was so inspired by his love of Arabic that he basically created the Hebrew grammar that became the basis of Hebrew learning throughout the Jewish world in the 10th century, 9th century. I don't remember exactly which, but it is in no small part due to that mixing with Arabic that we have a fully flowered and strong Hebrew language understanding and fluency today.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question about whether a name from Salonika is Sephardic. Gerasi, G-E-R-A-C-I.
So there is a Gerasi family. I think they are of Italian origin and belong, but I'd have to double check which synagogue they belong to.
Thank you.
There's a question about the Behar or Mevora names. Do they turn up in Portugal and Spain in the Middle Ages?
The Mevorah name is one that I don't think does. I'd have to check. Behar is again, it's a toponym, and it's one that I think I don't have specific examples, but I believe it does show up in the pre-expulsion Jewish community. But of course, there's actually multiple unrelated Behar families. So,
in Amsterdam, you may see that in the beginning of the 17th century, people added Hebrew names to their Portuguese or Spanish surnames, like Levi Rodriguez or Cohen Rodriguez, or if they didn't know if they were a Levi or a Cohen, they called themselves Israel Rodriguez. But there is also Yeshurun. Do you know what that means?
Yeshurun is one of the poetic names for Israel. It's the same thing. That practice dies out by the mid 17th century is when you start seeing people dropping, their tribal affiliation as upon returning. But you definitely see that the first half of the 17th century in the Western Sephardic world, not just in Amsterdam, but in Livorno, in Hamburg. But it's just a using a way of identifying that your religious tribal affiliation. But as I said before, I have no reason not to suspect that there is truth to the Levi and Cohen ancestry amongst the people who claimed it. That would be something fairly serious to claim without some kind of evidence. Now, whether or not it was remembered in the right way, whether it was passed down patrilineally, we can't really say. But that the Jewish community recognized them as such is good enough for us.
And what about the name Nahmias? Nahmias.
Nahmias?
Is that the same as Nehemiah?
Nehemiah? No. It's two different names.
Okay.
But both share a etymological origin.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question about the Zuzate of Amsterdam.
Which family?
Zuzate, Z-U-Z-A-R.
Right, the Zuzartes. I don't know. I mean, I come across them all the time in documents. I don't know nearly enough about any of them other than that they come from Portuguese families. I'm happy to take a look. But I know it's not a great answer, but that it is a name that shows up amongst the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, and actually that's one of the families that takes on a very German alias. They took on Swart during the 18th century in business dealings in 17th century, but that wasn't uncommon. That you have Portuguese families trading with German surnames. Or German names. I have people I'm researching who very Portuguese, but they use in trading, they use the name von Dunen, which is just it's very Germanic. So it's really when we see those, it's a matter of business for the most part.
Okay, we actually just had a question on chat. I'm sorry I can't see who asked it, about the Gothic influence of Sephardic names.
Absolutely.
Guzman, for example.
I don't know about Guzman. I'd have to check, but absolutely, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you really start seeing the adoption of stable surnames in Iberia, with being patronyms in the Visigothic tradition. So Rodriguez being Roderick, but that would just be you have to look at the etymology of the name and where it comes from. But yeah, a lot of the quote unquote common Hispanic names are actually of Germanic origin, but that just again speaks to the history of Iberia. Just like a lot of the Jews of Iberia have Arabic surnames, or even to a lesser extent some of the Catholic Spanish and Portuguese, because it speaks just to the wider history of who dominated the area, what was the lingua franca, what was the context.
Thank you. We have somebody's asking about the origins of Levi Maduro.
That's a question that I don't think any of us have successfully answered at this point. Again, Maduro coming from the Portuguese, but the adoption of levy, like I said, I'm sure there's a lot they're telling the truth about their that they do have a levy ancestor, thus qualifying them for it. But whether they remembered how exactly they were, at a certain point, it almost doesn't matter because they've been long accepted as Levites and been functioning that in terms of the religious community. So, but it is a question I think many of us do have, a passing research interest in, just because it's one of the leading members of the Curacao community, and pretty much everybody with some kind of connection to Curacao is related to them. So it's been a question that has befuddled at least a century's worth of historians and genealogists. So don't feel bad.
We should probably, sorry, rather overextending, we should probably end quite soon. We have a suggestion going back to the surname Moron. We know the area of Moron de la Almanza in Soria, but he's asking whether the Moron could be some adaptation from the Hebrew word sort of teacher, Moreh.
No.
Okay.
It's related to the toponym. It's a name that was taken on in the Jewish community through the forced conversion. On my mother's side, I descend from Moron of Izmir. They were members of the Portuguese synagogue right up until the synagogue basically burned down in the 20th century. They're very much a Portuguese family. The founder of the, even though we don't know how we connect, is because many of the documents are missing, but we know that the family in Izmir is descendant of a couple brothers who were actually arrested by the Inquisition of Venice. Though they were for Judaizing, but they were let go, and they actually were, one of them, Isaac, was one of the confidants of Shabbatai Tzvi in the 1650s before he declared that he was a Messiah. They're very much, it's Portuguese. It comes from the surnames that were given to our ancestors by their godparents when they were forcibly converted. And I don't know if it's Moron de Almanza that's referring to, but it's definitely comes from Iberian origin. There's no, as much as I like the idea of it, of Moreh to Moron, there's no relationship.
Thank you. Because we've been going about almost an hour and a half, so we should probably stop very soon. Can I just make an observation? Because at the beginning you started with this fake list of Sephardic surnames that had been made. One afternoon when I had nothing better to do, I sat down with that list, plus the list of the 100 most common surnames in Spain and Portugal. And all 100 of the most common surnames in Portugal appeared on that list, and 99 of the 100 most common surnames in Spain. I think Iglesias was missing from the list.
That's another good example of a pseudo Catholic. What's better to say that you're not a Jew than say I'm Iglesia, I'm a church.
No, that was the only name not claimed to be Sephardic on the.
So I actually have, in my experience, have had people say that to me, amongst, the Santa Cruz. So there is, funnily enough, the Santa Cruz family that appears to be related to Agadir in Morocco more than anything.
Thank you. I mean, that's just, we've sort of bombarded you, and you've found answers to virtually everything, which is really impressive. So thank you very much. I would like to just say that if people sort of want some research help from Michael, they can find him on the Hollander Was website. Just search on Google. Ton, would you like to close matters?
Yes. Thank you, Michael, for an excellent talk and for your general knowledge, which is being appreciated in the chat. We thank our patrons who support us. We are forever grateful for them for making this possible. We thank our viewers on Facebook, and we hope to see you all next week. We don't have a speaker yet, so it will probably be one of us, David or me. And well, bye for tonight, and see you all